This evening, please turn to the book of Zechariah, please. We're looking at chapter 11 this evening. So we're continuing our study is the book of Zechariah, one of the three prophets that we have scripture from during the period from captivity of the people of Judah returning from Babylonian captivity. In the first 6 chapters, as we recall, describe various visions that Zechariah had received, showing that God was restoring the people. They sent them into captivity for their sins. He was restoring them to his service, the priests and the governor and so on. But this is all symbolic of the gospel and Jesus Christ as our king and high priest. And then the latter chapters, which we're in now, are talking about prophecies regarding Judah and her enemies. And especially chapters 7 and 8 talked about some days of fasting that they were involved in. Now we're involved in chapters 9 through 11. And in these chapters we have some statements in which God is judging and the nations around them and punishment that's going to come upon them and the blessings and the judgments that are coming on Judah. And we're getting a very difficult section. We've made this point several times, that many people consider this to be the most difficult part of the Old Testament, these 6 chapters that we're involved in. So at times we struggle somewhat understanding for sure, but this is what I have suggested as the overall approach to chapters 9 through 11. Chapter 9 began discussing the punishment God was going to bring upon the enemies of Judah, especially those who had mistreated Judah, but also blessings that would come upon the people of Judah in the Messianic kingdom, talking about Jesus' triumphal entry and so on. Chapter 10, it seems to me, goes back to the time regarding their return from Babylonian captivity. No longer a prophecy of the Messianic age, but back to their situation, and again, more about the defeat of their enemies, although you may view some of that as having also a symbolic reference to Christ or the gospel. Chapter 11 then, I believe, goes back again now to the New Testament age, predicting, first of all, describing the sins that though God is accepting them now on their return from captivity, he realizes that they're going to go back into sin, ultimately to the point he's going to reject them as a nation because they reject Christ. I believe that's what chapter 11 is about. That when Jesus comes, the nation will have become, in general, not all, of course, but in general, so corrupt, the leaders rejecting God's will, following their own doctrines and so on, that they will reject Jesus and his teaching and the church and his kingdom, and ultimately be destroyed in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 to the Romans. I think that's what we're seeing. So we're in chapter 11 now. Chapter 9 was, I think we had that one pretty well down, describing the punishment on the enemies and then the coming of Jesus. In chapter 10, though, again, as I said, I believe went back to the fact that Judah would have victory in the sense that they'd come back from captivity, but their enemies would be defeated. He talked about how that they'd gone into captivity because they'd followed the prophets who spoke lies and left them as sheep without a shepherd. God would give them victory over their enemies, and in particular would bring back his people from Assyria and Egypt, which was symbolic of the nations where they've been scattered, not just those nations, but in symbolism of the nations that have brought them down. Now look into chapter 11, where we are now, and I believe we're back now to the, as I said, a prophecy to the future and the coming of Christ and his kingdom. Okay. Now, go back to chapter 11. Last week we started with the first 3 verses. Let's go ahead and read those 3 verses again. Just those 3, and we'll go on from then. Who'd like to read the first 3 verses of chapter 11 for us, please? 11, 1 through 3. Bill, please.
Open your doors, O Lebanon. The fire may devour your cedars. Wail, O cypress, for the cedar has fallen, because the mighty trees are ruined. Wail, O oaks of Bashan, for the thick forest has come down. There is a sound of wailing shepherds, for their glory is in ruins. There is the sound of roaring lions, for the pride of the Jordan is in ruins.
All right, and one of the points I tried to make last time, why I think there's a difference from chapter 10 to chapter 11. It's because in these first 3 verses, you see he mentions Lebanon in verse 1 and Bashan in verse 2, talking about how the fire is going to devour their cedars, their mighty trees will be ruined, and even the pride of the Jordan, which I take to be the forest and so on around the Jordan River. The shepherds are going to grieve for all of this. In contrast to, that's what we have here in chapter 11, a curse upon Lebanon and Bashan, which again is symbolic, of course. But back in chapter 10, we had a blessing on Lebanon and Gilead, which you can see is just right next to Bashan. So why would there be a blessing on these areas in chapter 10 and a curse on them in chapter 11 unless something significant has changed? That's just one indication to me that we're talking about a different time period than chapter 10. There's going to be a couple of other things, at least, we want to see as we go along. But that introduces to me the fact that there's a change from chapter 10 to chapter 11. Where he was accepting them in chapter 10, now there's going to be rejection, and we'll see why and the consequences as we go through chapter 11. But that's where we were at the end of class last time. But again, I realize it's difficult material, and some people may have some different viewpoints, and we can discuss that. But questions or discussion through 11 verse 3. Let's go ahead and read some more then, and we'll continue with the symbolism that he describes. Let's read, 4 through... well, let's just go 4 through 8 for now. Chapter 11, verses 4 through 8. Who'd like to read that for us, please? 11, 4 through 8. Who'd like to read that for us, please? Steve, please.
Thus says the Lord my God, feed the flock for slaughter, whose owners slaughter them and feel no guilt. Those who sell them say, Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their shepherds do not pity them. For I will no longer pity the inhabitants of the land, says the Lord, but indeed I will give everyone into his neighbor's hand and into the hand of his king. They shall attack the land, and I will not deliver them from their hand. So I fed the flock for slaughter, in particular the poor of the flock. I took for myself 2 staffs, the one I called beauty, and the other I called balm. And I fed the flock. I dismissed the 3 shepherds in 1 month. My soul loathed them, and their soul also abhorred me.
Okay, so if you listen to the overall tenor of what he's describing, you see how negative it is here towards especially the leaders and towards the treatment that they're going to receive. But if you go back to verse 4, what instruction does God give to Zechariah in verse 4? And we're looking now at question number, actually it's 4 through 6, those questions there on verses 4 and 5. What does he instruct them, Zechariah, to do? Bill.
It's time to feed the flock for slaughter.
Feed the flock, but he's going to feed them for slaughter. Well, what's the idea of that? What do you get that from, the meaning from that? To feed them for slaughter would mean what? Susie.
I took it to mean that he was to feed the flock that was destined for slaughter in the state that they were in.
Okay, yeah, that's what I took it to. Other comments? All right, so it's a flock that's destined for slaughter. But Zechariah is acting as a shepherd for a flock that's going to be slaughtered. So Zechariah, it seems to me, and we'll see as he goes on down to verse 7, he does this, he feeds the flock. So he's given Zechariah a responsibility to act as a shepherd for these people, because the shepherds that they have aren't doing their job right, so Zechariah is going to be their shepherd. So, but again, it's symbolism, understand. Other comments on that idea or thoughts? Frank?
The thought I had was about Zechariah being the shepherd to feed them
Yes.
for slaughter.
Yes.
He was continuing to preach God's word, but they were going to reject it. So he was going to be done with them and reject them.
Yes, and the idea of a shepherd feeding a flock is not just food, but leadership, like the elders of the New Testament are shepherds. And more specifically, like God is our shepherd, Psalm 23, Jesus is our good shepherd, John chapter 10, leadership and providing for needs and so on. So Zechariah was to do that on God's behalf. Again, I don't know whether he physically did it or whether it's just symbolism, but either way, it's the same point, that he is going to exercise a leadership like a shepherd, but it's for people that are destined for punishment. Other comments to verse 4. It really goes into verse 5 too. What about the leaders they've got in verse 5? How does he describe the leaders that they have in verse 5? Terry.
They had no concern for the flock. They just saw them as something they could use to their own benefit.
Okay. So they slaughter the flock, and they don't feel guilty about it. They don't see anything wrong about that. In fact, it says, they say, "Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich." They don't have any pity on the people. What does they mean when they say, "Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich"? How does that fit with the attitude these shepherds have? Comments on that? Susie?
Reminds me of the Pharisee and the, who's the other one?
Scribes.
No.
The tax collector.
Yes.
Publican.
Yeah, that he was so grateful for how good he was. And he praised God, but that was false praise.
And thought he was in great shape when he wasn't at all. And it seems to me like that they think that the blessings they have, even blessings that they get from mistreating other people, they take that as a sign that God is with them. Because look how blessed I am. And so on, when really they've gotten these blessings from mistreating other people. Okay? So you have cruel, corrupt shepherds, which is apparently why God said for Zechariah to act as shepherd symbolically to lead the people. Okay, other comments on verse 5? Notice, Terry.
The idea they had no pity for them. The shepherd's job is to protect and care for the sheep.
Right.
And that wasn't what they were looking at all. They had no concern for what their responsibility was.
And it says that they feel no guilt about it. They don't feel bad about it at all. And we've seen that again other times, haven't we? Keep the studies like this in the context with our other studies of the prophets, where again and again the prophets have rebuked the leaders of the people for not fulfilling their responsibility, not leading the people for the good of the people, to help them to serve God, which is what the leaders are supposed to be doing. But instead they're using it for their own personal gain. It doesn't bother them if poor people suffer, or those who are orphans and widows and so on. They don't mind mistreating them for their own gain. Just like Jesus talked about the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23 in the New Testament times. So that's what these people are like. And it seems fine with them to do that. It doesn't bother them a bit. They think they're fine. Other comments on verse 5? Rick?
It reminds me, this all happens when times are good. They're prosperous. They're prospering here, and they don't feel guilty about it at all, that they have to do the things they do to prosper. And it just reminds me of today's world where we have it so good here in this country. We have foods in our refrigerator. We have homes to live in. We have heat. We have air conditioning. Everything. Do we really appreciate, do we know this comes from God?
Okay. And we have leaders who don't seem to mind leading people in ways that, for their own benefit, whether it helps the people or not. So much of this is certainly true today. But as we go along, we're going to see, as we get down especially to verse 12 and 13, he's talking about a particular time when this was true. And we'll get down to that in verse 12 and 13. Okay, so what does God say about the people then in verse 6? Question number 7. What's he going to do or not do about the people according to verse 6? Bill.
The Lord says he's going to no longer pity the inhabitants of the land.
He's not going to have pity for them. Okay. And he says, okay, other comments on verse 6. What's going to happen to the people? Because God doesn't care for them now, what's going to happen to them? Verse 6. Terry.
There's going to be some kind of destruction come upon them from the people around them, and perhaps even foreign country coming in. But it calls them their neighbors and the hand of his king.
Okay. So God is no longer going to protect them from their enemies. Back in chapter 10, at that point, he was protecting them from defeating the enemies, punishing the enemies, and protecting the people of Judah as his people, because they restored to his relationship. But now the time is coming when he's not going to protect them. The leaders are leading them astray, and he's not going to protect them anymore. They're going to fall prey to their enemies rather than the enemies being punished, as in chapter 10. Now the people are going to fall prey to their own enemies and their king. They'll attack the land, and he's not going to deliver them. He's not going to protect them. When this time comes, the time he talked about here. Okay? Other comments or questions through verse 6? Frank.
Well, we've been talking about in the previous chapter about the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and that according to, if we apply verse 6, the neighbors at hand, these foreign countries that punish them, that God's going, when he's done with Assyria and Babylon, they will be punished too for their evil. And that punishment will come without pity from God.
That's true. We'll see as we follow along. I think he's primarily talking about supposed to be his people here, people of Judah. But of course, what you're saying is true. And if you follow through the New Testament, get to the book of Revelation, the same point is made. Those who God uses to punish his people, again here, he's going to punish them later on, book of Revelation. So a pattern, you see, follows through. Okay, but again, let's follow through and let's see more about where he's talking, what time in the future he's talking about. Okay, verse 7. So what does Zechariah do? God tells him he's not going to protect the people, he's not going to deliver them. Zechariah is supposed to lead people that God's not going to protect. So what does Zechariah do? Verse 7.
Fed. They were fed.
Okay, he feeds them. What else do we learn about them? What else does he do? Rick.
Made himself 2 staffs, one called beauty, the other one called bonds.
All right. So he makes 2 staffs, 2 rods. He feeds the flock. He tries to give them leadership, but he makes these 2 staffs. Okay. All right. So, okay. Makes the 2 staffs, beauty and bonds. Now, doesn't explain here what they're about. But we'll see as we go along the significance of these staffs. Other comments anyone have about the idea of the 2 staffs at this point in verse 7? It's going to be explained more as we go along. Did somebody have other translations? What other translations do you have besides beauty and bonds? There's some other translations that may help us. But I have another translation. Terry?
The ESV says they were named favor and union.
Okay. Instead of beauty, it's favor. Instead of bonds, it's union or unity. Okay. And actually, that helps me. But we see as we go along what happens to those two staffs. So at some point, somebody has God's favor and union, but we're going to see that's going to change as we go along. Okay? Other comments through verse... Well, one more point. Zechariah is feeding the flock that's destined to be slaughtered, but who in particular is he caring for? Susie, you have a comment?
But I'm just going to answer
Sure.
that the poor, but the humble in heart.
Okay. Now we're going to see that explained as we go along too. Jesus in Matthew 5 would call it the poor in spirit. We'll see about who these poor are as we go along too. Terry, do you have your hand up?
Yes, when I look at the two staffs that he had Zechariah make, it seems like it was showing his God's expectation for the flock. He didn't get that, but that was what he expected from the flock. This
Okay.
union with him and his favor. He wanted to bestow his favor upon them, but they didn't want to participate in that.
Okay. That's what a shepherd should accomplish. The shepherd uses a staff to benefit the people. And this shepherd has two staffs. One is going to provide favor, and one's going to provide union. But it doesn't work out that way. That's the intent, but it doesn't work out that way. All right, let's go ahead and see. All right, so here's our two staffs. Best I could do, folks, all right? Okay? Beauty and bonds, or favor and union. So Zechariah has these two staffs. Especially he's concerned about the poor, but we'll see what happens as we go along, all right? Now, verse 8. What does he do? Zechariah is acting on behalf of God now, or as a shepherd to the people, but what does he do? In verse 8. Steve.
You dismissed.
Who? Who does he dismiss?
Shepherds.
The shepherds. So, he's been put, like you might say, the chief shepherd, sort of like, the high shepherd. The other shepherds, he's getting rid of them. He's dismissing them. Some translations even say he's annihilating them. He's getting rid of them. Even in 1 month. Not taking long to do it. Why? Last part of verse 8. Rick.
It says he loathed them and he abhorred them.
He abhorred them, and they abhorred him. Mutual antagonism between these shepherds and Zechariah. But remember, Zechariah is acting for God. Okay? Just like in Jesus' parables. So sometimes, well, like the father of the prodigal son represents God, or some of the other prophecies, the master who has the supper for his son and so on, represents God. Well, Zechariah is acting as the chief shepherd, acting as God here. He isn't God, we understand it. It's symbolic. But here's this antagonism between him and the shepherds who are leading the people. Okay? So he dismisses them. He's going to get rid of them. In verse 8. Because of they're not only not doing their job, but they don't have proper respect for God. So God doesn't respect them. Okay, other comments, verse 8. All right, so he says there's 3 shepherds. We didn't talk about that yet. 3 shepherds. Now, he doesn't explain who the 3 are, but try to put this again in the context of other passages we've studied in the prophets about the shepherds. The shepherds of the people are their leaders. Any thoughts about who the 3 shepherds would represent? Or 3 groups of shepherds would be who? Steve.
Kings.
Kings? That's one. Rick?
I would say Judah, Israel, and the house of Joshua.
Okay. Joshua would be the priest. Okay. Okay. Other comments? Other thoughts? Right?
Well, Steve mentioned the kings, and I was thinking of the priests and the prophets, the false, those that were evil and feeding lies to the people, kings, priests, and prophets.
Okay, and again, he doesn't explain it, so that's, we're not sure of that, but that's what I thought of too. Other comments? Susie?
Okay, if we're saying that this has a dual meaning of the Messianic age.
I'm not saying a dual meaning. I think it's the Messianic age, period.
Okay, so if it's the Messianic age,
Yes.
then I guess what I was reading and studying about that the spiritual leaders, the civil or spiritual leaders like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes,
Okay.
and like the Sanhedrin, that whole Jewish, and then the priesthood and the prophets, that whole Jewish system was going to be done away with.
That's the point. Regardless of who we specifically identify those three groups as, that's the point. The spiritual leaders of the nation are, just like he described back in verse 7, verse 5, they're misleading the people. They're leading the people into slaughter. They don't feel bad about it. So they would be, I would say, the civil rulers, the priests, and the religious leaders. May not really be prophets, but the religious leaders, the priests, and the, which would be, like he said, the scribes and Pharisees, the people who are responsible to teach them and lead them, weren't doing their job right. They were leading them into error. But regardless of how you identify those three, that's the point. So Zechariah, acting on God's behalf, is going to dismiss them. If you dismiss the leaders of the nation, what's going to happen to the nation? He's describing the downfall, I believe, of the nation of Judah when Jesus comes again. Now, I talked about the change from chapter 10, but there's going to be some more signs that tell us this as we go along. Any questions or comments? It ties together, so we keep moving, but questions or comments through verse 8. Let's read some more and see how it ties together. Let's read 9 through, at least through 13. All right, 9 through 13. You'd like to read 9 through 13 for us, please. Chapter 11, verse 9 through 13. Neil.
Then I said, I will not pasture you. What is to die, let it die. And what is to be annihilated, let it be annihilated. And let those who are left eat one another's flesh. I took my staff favor, and I cut it into pieces, to break my covenant which I had made with all the peoples. So it was broken on that day, and thus the afflicted of the flock who were watching me realized that it was the word of the Lord. I said to them, if it is good in your sight, give me my wages, but if not, never mind. So they weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, that magnificent price at which I was valued by them. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and threw them to the potter in the house of the Lord.
Okay. So now we have some more information about these staffs and a specific passage that ties it specifically to the Christ in the New Testament. But let's continue. Verse 9. Zechariah says, speaking for God, what does Zechariah say he's going to do, or specifically not going to do, in verse 9? We're in question number 12 now, and the following questions. What you say he's not going to do for him, Frank?
I will not feed you or pasture you,
Okay.
watch over you.
And because he doesn't feed them or care for them, what's going to happen? Some are going to die, some are perish, and some are even going to attack one another. Okay, and obviously graphic language to describe it. Okay. So you're talking about these people who, back in chapter 10, at that time he was blessing. Now there's curses, and God's not going to protect them. He's not going to take care of them. And there's going to be death and perishing, and so on. Other comments on verse 9? All right, now verse 10, we get to the staffs again. The first one. What happens to the first staff? Beauty, you notice that Neo's translation said favor. Staff called beauty or favor, what happens to it? Bill.
He's going to take the staff and cut it in two, and so he can break the covenant which he had made with all the people.
All right, so that staff of favor is going to be broken. Staff of beauty of favor. So, okay, comments, discussion on that? What's the significance of that? Terry?
Well, when we look at the Messianic age, the covenant that God had made with his people came to an end.
Okay. So the shepherd, representing God, through Zechariah here, who is using his protection and his favor that's going to destroy that. Okay? No more protection from God. No more favor from God. Last in verse 6. God says, I will not deliver them from their hand anymore. Okay? Other comments? The breaking of the covenant, that would be obvious, I think, except for a problem I have is he says, I break the covenant made with all the peoples. Who are all the peoples? Gentiles. The peoples of the Gentiles. So what covenant did God make with the Gentiles, including all the people that he broke here? Now, I struggle with that one. That if it was the covenant with the people of Judah or his people, then that would be obvious as we apply it to the Messianic age. But this is all the people's thoughts on that or comments? Terry?
Well, the idea that you could proselyte and become part of the Jewish nation, and you were under that covenant. So it didn't matter whether you were a Jew or whether you were proselyted into the Jewish nation, that covenant was going to be done away with, broken, fulfilled and broken, not to be used again.
Okay, that's one possibility. I hadn't really thought of that, but that's a possibility. Other thoughts? Okay, well, in any case, even though I struggle with that, there's no question about the fact he's breaking this protection, his promise to care for as the shepherd for the people. That's going to be broken.
There's also the promise that God made in the Garden of Eden when he said that he was going to bring someone to put an end to the power of Satan. And that promise was made to all people.
Okay, and so there's other possibilities. I'm just, for myself, I'm not sure what it means. But now, verse 11. When was it broken? Verse 11 was broken when? On that day. Remember that expression? We began the book, in our introduction, we talked about the fact that this expression, Zechariah uses that again and again, especially starting here in chapter 11 through chapter 14. On that day, in that day, again and again and again and again. Expression for the Messianic age, the gospel, the New Testament. And we're going to see it some more as we go along here. So he's talking about a particular time here. So that's another clue, I think, about what he's talking about. And of course, we'll get to a strong one in verses 12 and 13. So on that day, the staff was broken. But now we get back to the poor, or the afflicted, as Neo's translation said. What about the poor or the afflicted? What about them in verse 11? Bill.
The poor were watching, and they knew it was the word of the Lord.
All right. So the poor, go back to verse 7. Zechariah especially fed or cared for the poor of the flock. They turn out to be the ones who recognize what God's doing and appreciate it. So not everybody in the nation followed those false leaders. Not everybody went into error, and he's not talking about everybody here when he talks about those who are wrong. Some of them recognized what God was doing as being the action of God, the right thing. They appreciated it. And those are described as the poor or the afflicted of the nation. Other comments on verse 11? How does that fit? If it's the Messianic age, how does that fit? Susie? Did you have it?
Good.
The remnant that God has kept.
Okay, it's the remnant. And you remember 1 Corinthians 1 and even the lifetime of Jesus, in general, it wasn't the leaders of the people that were included. Some were, but that not in general. In general, it was the poor classes of people that were accepted the truth and followed Jesus and so on. Other comments through verse 11. Okay, so you've got some who recognize it as being the word of the Lord. All right, well, we just get to the critical part, verses 12 and 13. So, what does Zechariah say, and what's the response in verses 12 and 13?
Wages of 30 pieces of silver.
He says, give me my wages. And they give him 30 pieces of silver. And what happens to it? Verse 13. Throws it to the potter. And so he took the 30 pieces of silver, he threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. All right, well, that's a passage, again, we can nail it down. How is that fulfilled in the New Testament?
In Matthew 27, 5 through 8. And when he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself, the chief priest took the silver pieces and said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury because they are price of blood. They consulted together and fought within the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day.
And as you keep reading, it says it was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Okay? And here we have it as surely, at least that fulfillment includes this passage. The wages, the amount of the wages is stated, 30 pieces of silver, thrown to the potter, put in the temple and thrown to the potter. Okay? But we need to quit. Time's up. But let's come back next time on verses 12 and 13. See how Zechariah is using it. See how it is fulfilled in the New Testament with Jesus. And see where that leads us then as we go through the rest of chapter 11. Okay? Other comments before we close? Okay, thank you.